one. Take two.
Take two.
Yes.
So this is take two from our interview, our podcast, Buddhist View Podcast with John Pettit. Thank you very much, John, for
Thank you, Dana.
agreeing to doing it over.
Sure.
So how are you? How are you doing?
Good, thank you. Yeah, loving it here in Nepal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We are at the Rupa Maker shop right now.
Yes.
You guys can see
Yes,
beautiful location.
a shop and a family business that I have patronized since 1993.
Very nice. So John is an expert on Mipham Rinpoche, who I am very fond of. I really admire and love Mipham Rinpoche. So I want to really take this precious opportunity to learn some things about Mipham from John. So I actually took the time to take a few questions this time. So I'm wondering, maybe actually before I ask the questions, I guess, for people who are not familiar, maybe you can tell us who is Mipham Rinpoche?
Who is Mipham Rinpoche? Well, Mipham Rinpoche was born in the year of the fire horse, which means that that next year will be the 180th anniversary of his birth. So that's 1846, and he passed away in 1912. So he's a Lama of fairly recent memory. And when I was a young Dharma student, in the sort of occasional entourage of Dodo Khyentse Rinpoche, the Tibetan people, some of the lamas used to refer to him still as Lama Mipham. He's still remembered fondly as Lama Mipham. So he's long gone on one level, but another level still the memory and the sense of closeness to Mipham Rinpoche in the lineage. He's felt to be like a very close, vital presence today, as a scholar and as a transmitter of the Vajrayana teachings.
Mm-hmm. What was the role Mipham played? I understand he was part of the Rimé Movement, the non-sectarian movement in the Kham resistance.
Yeah. Well, he was... it's hard to say exactly that it's a movement. I mean, it's called a movement, and I think that, Gene Smith might have been the first person to employ that expression, movement. But it was not a lot of individuals involved, but the ones who were central to it, for example, in the Sakya lineage, Lotera Wangpo, Janya Khyentse Wangpo, and Jamgon Kongtrul, particularly those three, their efforts were quite well concerted. In other words, they worked together, they supported each other, and they shared information and ideas about what needed to be done. So it was, in that sense, it was a movement. But really, it was above more than anyone else. It was those three, and in producing large collections of work that didn't exist before. So a lot of their work, the Rimé movement, was actually not so much teaching or practice per se. It was publishing. So that's what made so-called Rimé more of a force than it might have been otherwise. Because in a way, Rimé or non-sectarianism is a very old tradition within Buddhism. I believe it was Xuanzang, among others, who traveled in India, in the 7th or 8th century. And he observed that many monks of many different backgrounds and studying many different philosophies were all living under the same roof in different monasteries. So just because you were a member of a particular monastery like Odantapuri or Vikramasila or one of the other big monasteries in Buddhist India, it didn't mean that you were all following the same philosophy. You may have been fond of this particular version of philosophy. Or another version like that. Some were following Hinayana, some were following Mahayana. But everybody kind of lived and worked and studied together, and at least in some places that was the case. So Rimé, or non-sectarianism within Buddhism, is an old movement, and it's the revival into that was important because first of all, because rare lineages were at risk of being lost. Lineages that weren't being practiced very much or studied very much. Specifically especially in the Vajrayana, which is a vast, body of teachings. A lot of those teachings are only given orally or only could be understood properly with oral transmission and discussion, between teacher and student like that. So one reason for the Rimé movement and all the publishing efforts and also teaching, related teaching efforts, transmissions being given, is to preserve those lineages. Another reason is because when you have big, powerful monasteries and very charismatic teachers and so on, there's liable to be competition. It's kind of the default mode. And even when the great masters don't feel competitive towards each other, the students of those masters will feel competitive. And so, having something called the Rimé movement or approach, even if it's not really a school, because it's only predicated on the existence of different schools and different lineages, but just to have this kind of point of view is positive, to prevent the politics, the political destruction of the true Dharma.
The Rimé movement, I feel sometimes is confused as, I practice everything and everything is fine, but it's more like a respect towards all lineages, whereas one has one's own main practice lineage. Would you understand it, Nehot?
Well, I think it's, nobody can, I shouldn't say nobody, but almost no one can actually practice everything. I don't think even Janggon Control or the great Kensei could practice everything equally. But they certainly did a good job at practicing almost everything really well, right? So, but those are two very extraordinary individuals. Mipham Rinpoche, I wouldn't describe him as that kind of Rimé practitioner. He was much more of a Nyingma scholar, and that was actually his mandate from the great Kensei, which was to, according to one of the biographies, write some textbooks for our tradition. So when the great Kensei said that to Lama Mipham, I think it was understood he meant the Nyingma tradition, or maybe he meant the broader tradition, which includes, the philosophical viewpoints of Nyingma, Sakya, Kagyu, and Gelug in an overarching way, but particularly with attention to defining what the Nyingma point of view is. So Mipham was, he was part of the movement, and he received, I'm sure, many transmissions, especially from his root teacher, Janggon Kensei Wangpo. But in terms of his study and his practice, the best record we have are his collected works. And in those, it seems to me that he was almost exclusively focused on practicing according to the Nyingma Vajrayana tradition. That was the main part of his practice, with also, obviously, a certain amount of influence from the Sakya side, because it's normal, actually, for people to receive. If you're a Nyingma practitioner, it's almost inevitable that you'll receive some empowerments that come from the Sakya tradition, even if it's just a few, relatively minor empowerments, like Green Tara or White Manjushri. These are not the highest of the high meditational deities, but still, it's quite common. So anyway, yeah. So Mipham was Rimé in the sense that he was exposed to those teachings, and he was close to Kensei Wangpo particularly, and also he had a Dharma connection with Jamgon Kongtrul, the great. But I mean, his own practice and his writing as a scholar, he's really a Nyingma.
So, Mipham being maybe sort of a systematizer of the Nyingma philosophical outlook, I guess.
Well, that was what the great Kensei wanted him to do, and actually, he didn't finish everything that he planned to write in that regard. There was a plan that he would write 5 texts called Reltree or Sword, and 5 texts called Pema or Lotus. So he would write these 5, and these would relate to different aspects of Dharma as well as practice and the study of the external sciences and so on. He never completed those 5. There's just an aside that Mipham Rinpoche's greatest successes didn't include everything the great Kensei asked him to do, unfortunately.
So what did Mipham use to develop this Nyingma position?
His main source in terms of the use of logic, and especially in defense of the Dzogchen teachings from a philosophical point of view, was Rongzom Mahapandita. Rongzom Pandita was the author of some early philosophical texts which indicate that he was very well versed in both the Nyingma as well as the Sarma or new translations. So he was, upholding the Nyingma Vajrayana, but he was also extremely well versed in whatever other Vajrayana and Sutrayana teachings were being given in his lifetime. That is in the 11th century. So that's one of the major sources for Mipham membership. But who was it who was saying to me? Anyway, I was having a discussion on this recently, and the other person I was speaking with said they felt that overridingly it was Longchen Rabjam, the 14th century master who wrote so many brilliant commentaries on Buddhist philosophy and also on the great perfections of Pochempo. That's the number one source for Mipham membership. But Longchenpa's writings, although they're comprehensive from a sutra as well as tantra point of view, and they're especially comprehensive from a Nyingma Vajrayana point of view, but they're not comprehensive in the same way that the collected works of, let's say, the 8th Karmapa would be complete and comprehensive from the standpoint of studying Madhyamaka, right? So Longchenpa never wrote a separate commentary on the Madhyamaka Avatar, as far as we know. If he did, it's been lost. And that's one of the ways in which Mipham Rinpoche could supplement the number one source for Nyingma philosophical understanding, which is Longchenpa, of course. But to really supplement that, one would need a commentary on Chandrakirti, as well as Nagarjuna, which tends to favor or tends to inculcate the Dzogchen point of view, or the Nyingma understanding of Madhyamaka.
Also, some people point a finger at Longchenpa, saying that he was a pseudo Shentonpa. What do you think?
Oh, I think that's unfortunate. People say that the 3rd Karmapa was a Shentonpa also, but I've looked at what each of them has to say about Buddha nature, and they say practically the same thing. I think Longchenpa says it better. He was a greater, as a literary genius, he was, above and beyond everyone else at his time, But otherwise, the 3rd Karmapa and Longchenpa had I think, exactly the same point of view on Buddha nature, which means that, well, they could be Shentonpas, but they never really talked about Shenton, either of them, as far as I know. And people say, well, they're both contemporaries of Dalpopa, but I don't think either of them was following Dalpopa. In the Karmakagyu lineage, the later authors that followed Dalpopa, Rigzin Sewang Lorga was one. I haven't read his work, but he's supposed to have been a strong Shentonpa, and also Jambun Kongtrul is following Dalpopa very closely. They're definitely Shentonpas, but I don't think it's anachronistic, for one, because first of all, Longchenpa never met Dalpopa, as far as we know. They must have known of each other, by reputation, but Longchenpa was never interested in what Dalpopa was doing, as far as we know. He never wrote anything, and he might have used the word Shenton once in the 7 Treasures, but not in a way that had anything to do with the heated philosophical discussion that was developing, around Dalpopa's writings. So, some people might look back and say, see, this proves that Longchenpa was a Shentonpa because they want him to be one. They want him to be one of us, But actually, there's many versions of Shentong, and the basic distinction of Shentong is that reality is empty of delusion, but it's not empty of its own qualities. That's actually not a very controversial point of view. You can tease that point of view out of many sutras and tantras easily, without building a gigantic philosophical system on top of that. Which is what Dalpopa did.
Also, the 3rd Karmapa and Longchenpa were Dharma friends, right? Or
yes, they were. They were Dharma. They were Vajra brothers. They were both students of Kumaraza, the great Dzogchen and Nyingtik teacher. Yeah.
So besides Rongzompa, Longchenpa, is there any other main figure that...
well, in our take 1, I mentioned Gorampa, Sönam Senge,
yes,
who was, I guess he was a 15th century philosopher and master of the Sakya lineage. His teacher was Rongton Sheja Kunrik, who is also a noted author. I think some people regarded Rongtompa as also having been a Shentonpa, but I see no evidence of that from what I could gather. But regardless, yeah, that was the teacher of Gorampa, and so Gorampa was the author of several important Madhyamaka commentaries. Like there's a general discussion or general outline of Madhyamaka, Ume Chidon. So Chi and Don. Chi means general, Don means meaning. So the idea is outline or general meaning, and the Ume Chidon is actually a pretty long text. I think it's at least 200 folios. That's a lot of Madhyamaka information there. And then the more famous of his texts, and the one that I'm personally well acquainted with from reading it, studying it, in my research back in the day, is called the Differentiation of the View, or Tawe Shenje. And this is a somewhat controversial work because he vehemently criticizes both Shentong as well as the Gelugpa Madhyamaka system. And this was, I'm sure extremely irritating to a lot of great Gelugpa scholars back in those days.
Which is why they made his writings illegal, I guess, right?
Gorampa's writings?
I think so, no?
I don't know. I mean, well, he might have been, they might have taken copies of his work and put them under lock and key in certain places where the Gelugpas held the most power. It's possible.
Yes.
I don't think he was never banned in the same way that Śakya Chokden, who was the kind of one of the great anomalies within the Sakya tradition. Śakya Chokden was a great Shentong teacher. But and I think also Śakya Chokden was also a student of. He was a contemporary, I believe, of Gorampa. But yeah, Śakya Chokden his works were banned, and then, if I've understood correctly, none of his works were not recovered in Tibet after the Cultural Revolution. If there was a copy of them, I don't know if that copy inside Tibet was recovered or not, but the way that his works came back into currency was by being discovered in Bhutan. Because Śakya Chokden was very highly regarded as a Vajrayana Buddhist teacher in Bhutan.
Oh, really? I didn't.
Yeah, he is a guru, and he visited and he gave empowerments, and also he wrote some of his Shentong works there.
Oh, interesting.
So, and the Bhutanese never regarded it as a big deal that some people were Shentong and some people were Rongtong, and somehow the Bhutanese never got involved in that hysteria.
Interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, but going back to Gorampa, Gorampa was a fierce critic of both the Gelug and Shentong, and I would say that many of the basic points that Gorampa makes are reiterated or elaborated even in, for example, Mipham's commentary on Chandrakirti, the what's it called, Introduction to the Middle Way. Here's the book. Yeah. So in this commentary, translated here very, very well by the Madhyamaka Translation Committee. Some of the criticisms that Gorampa makes are taken up there. I would say that the tone of the polemic is different. Gorampa was quite willing to push buttons, and probably one of the reasons is that one of the great critics of the Sakya Madhyamaka tradition in those days was very hard on Rongton Sheja Kunrik, that is the teacher of Gorampa. And that was it was Kedrubje. And so Kedrubje, wrote his Umi Chidon or something similarly titled, which is like a general discussion of Madhyamaka from the Gelugpa side, from the Tsongkhapa side. And in one of his, he writes a little poem in there somewhere, or at least this poem was translated by Jose Cabezon in his study, in his translation and study of that work. And he makes fun of Rongtongpa. He accuses him of flying the banner of Shenrab, which was true, that actually Rongtongpa in his own village was regarded as a great Bonpo master. But in central Tibet, and in connection with the great monasteries and teaching lineages of Sakya, he was regarded as a great scholar of Buddhism. So anyway, it was a cheap shot. And I think Gorampa didn't like that. So he really lays into the Gelugpas and belittles them and makes a lot of fun of them in his work. Whereas Mipham Rinpoche, again, I think this is where the idea of Rimé becomes relevant. He's not trying to push buttons. He's taking issue with very specific points, just like Gorampa did, but leaving out the personal tone. So I think that's one way to distinguish Mipham from some of his possible predecessors, is that he's really bracketing out the personal politics and the attitude that might sometimes rear its ugly head in philosophical debate.
Interesting. Yeah. Then, with all this talk of scholasticism, philosophical study, Mipham being from the Nyingma side of things, usually the Nyingmapas have been maybe previously in history were thought of as being more practice-oriented, right? Compared to the Sakyapas or the Lupas. Then, how does Mipham reconcile this aspect of practice, a simple practice approach, along with his philosophical vigor?
Yeah.
And how can we understand that if into a practical way as modern day practitioners? Like how, or what is basically my question is, what is Mipham telling us? How can we incorporate philosophical study into our normal Dharma practice, Dharma session?
Well, that's a question that there are as many answers as there are questioners, or as many answers as there are teachers being questioned, or scholars being questioned. Like the whole question of how to integrate it's usually understood as something that one could do based on the pith instructions, or personal instructions of a teacher. So someone that knows me well and is a great teacher is preeminently well qualified to guide me. And if I appreciate that and I'm willing to listen, then I can profit immensely from the advice. And that includes how to integrate study. Over the years, especially when I was just young and just learning the ropes of both philosophy and also Dharma practice from the Nyingma point of view. I was given some advice from time to time. For example, one eminent Lama, the late Tuku Tundrup, he was a very well-known translator of texts related to Dzogchen and Nyingma Vajrayana. He said, when you read the Churingzi, or the precious treasury of the expanse of phenomena, don't try to figure it out. Just read it and just let it flow through you. Don't try to analyze it too much, because at that age I was trying to analyze it, and you could see that I wasn't going to get any closer to Dzogchen by trying to analyze Longchenpa's writings, and I'm sure that was good advice. And then later, looking at it now, okay, maybe I could apply a certain amount of analysis, but and I've done this with friends. We read the Churingzi together. Some old friends that also know Tibetan and have been practitioners for a long, long time, and were students of great masters like Tenli Norbu Rinpoche, Trekgyal Namkyn Norbu, Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche, in my case. But this was a Zoom group that we did during COVID, and so we all brought a lot of experience and knowledge to the table. But it was very tempting in reading Longchenpa to go down all kinds of avenues of trivial analysis. We tangentially departed from the main message of that text because there's so many fascinating implications in the language. And also you wonder, why did he phrase it this way? Why did he put it this way? Or why does he mention this here? Why does he quote, when he's giving his own commentary on Dzogchen, but he's quoting from a master like a Dharmakirti, or Chandrakirti. Or from certain other places, he's quoting, in a way almost out of context. Those were not authors of Dzogchen texts. They were Mahayana philosophers, and so when it comes to reading, and studying the Dharma, and I'm thinking here specifically of Dzogchen because that is the highest teaching and the overarching teaching of the Nyingma tradition. It's tempting to want to try to make that into something that relates to a topic or an approach that's easier to understand. Because actually Madhyamaka is easier in a way. You can brute force your way into a brilliant understanding of Madhyamaka just by applying your intellect and analyzing, studying a lot, discussing a lot, reading a lot. You can do that. But in Dzogchen, you can't do that. There's no brute force way to understand Dzogchen. You have to understand it according to the instruction of your teacher, and also on the basis of empowerment. But you can leave your brilliant scholar intellect at the door. It would be better. But having said that, then there's still the consideration that most people aren't ready to just leave their mind at the door and to be awakened very quickly by devotion to their teacher, or because of their previous karma might be so pure and perfect that they can get Dzogchen like this, and then they'll never fall back. Most of us are just not like that. I mean, maybe I heard it said maybe 1 in 100,000 people who approaches the Dharma might have that kind of capacity. So therefore, you have in the writings of Mipham Rinpoche, most famously, the Beacon of Certainty. That's an introduction to the Dzogchen teaching that uses Madhyamaka as a vehicle, and touches on some important topics of debate, which are really scholastic in nature. They're not really topics that everyone needs to contemplate. But a serious student of Buddhism who also has some background in philosophy, like Madhyamaka, for example, and who has a practice of meditation, according to the secret mantra Vajrayana of the Nyingma tradition, or of another tradition for that matter. But whatever their secret mantra Vajrayana connection is, anyone could read the Beacon of Certainty, and then have a better intellectual understanding, if not of the real Dzogchen, because that's something that comes from a teacher. It comes in empowerment and it comes in your own experience. But the philosophical Dzogchen, which is the discussion around it, right? There is a discussion around it. It started with Rongzom Mahapandita, was also continued by Longchen Rabjam, in his 7 treasuries particularly. He touches on some of the philosophical implications of Dzogchen and relates those back to the Paramita Yana, the Mahayana, and so on. So there is that discussion. And that's where certain writings of Mipham Rinpoche, I would say, particularly the Beacon of Certainty, the Sword of Discernment, and indirectly at least, his commentaries on Mahayana philosophy, his commentary on the Madhyāntavibhāga, discriminating the middle and extremes, the Madhyāmakālaṅkāra, Madhyamaka and a few other places where he's just discussing Madhyamaka and philosophy in a more general way. So in all of those places you can find guidance. This is how to introduce, especially a person who's not afraid of reading difficult material and mastering subtle distinctions according to philosophy. That person can open the door to the Vajrayana and to Dzogchen.
I'm very glad you mentioned the Madhyāntavibhāga.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm researching this text a little bit now. And I'm also curious to ask, in that case, so Madhyāntavibhāga, some people label this text as a kind of a Madhyamaka text from the point of view of Yogācāra.
Madhyamaka text from the point of view of Yogācāra?
Meaning they're explaining the middle way from the point of view of the 3 natures.
Well, yes. Of course, that's precisely what the Madhyāntavibhāga is. It's Madhyamaka, but it's Yogācāra Madhyamaka, we can say. And this idea of the middle way, or Madhyama Pratipat, that's the expression that Nagarjuna uses, but also Vasubhanu uses it in the Uttananja and the distinguishing the middle from the extremes. He also uses the Umelam, or Madhyama Pratipat in Sanskrit. So that's a very old idea. And even at the in the very early phase of the Buddhist teachings, the teachings that are codified more or less completely as the Theravada Buddhist canon, the Pali canon, they also have that Madhyama Patipat, like that. So it's a little bit different sounding in Pali, but it's the same expression. So the middle way could be understood many different ways. I mean, originally, at least in maybe the very early phase, like the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, the Buddha represented his path to people that didn't know him and didn't know his teachings well. as somewhere in between the extreme of asceticism and the extreme of indulgence. So, when the Buddha was offered this exquisite yogurt by the cow herding girl Sujata, some people, some of the other ascetics were shocked first of all by the fact that he was actually eating good food. And secondly, he was allowing a very beautiful girl to bring the food to him every day while he sat and meditated. And some of the Buddha's companions, his yogic companions, thought that he had lost his discipline, that he was no longer staying to the true path. But from the Buddhist point of view, no, it's perfectly acceptable. He's not abandoning his discipline. He's not torturing himself, And if he was a good yogi bent on achieving enlightenment at that very moment, probably he wasn't fooling around with her either. But one of my own gurus suggested that, regardless of the Buddha was, we assume, we would tend to assume at that point in his career when he was almost reaching Buddhahood, he didn't need a consort per se. But if he was a Mahayana practitioner, or already had the realization of a Vajrayana, like a Vajradhara practitioner like that, then, having this beautiful woman come to him would have given him a lot of joy and satisfaction. Just seeing her there, just receiving a little bit of help from her in the form of food would have been quite a powerful stimulus for his being able to reach Buddhahood at that time. This is what my own guru actually, who rarely would say something like this, but he said this once, in a Zoom conference in the context of another teaching. But he mentioned this, and I thought this is very, very interesting. So the middle way, even at the level of the Hinayana, means that, if a person has the capacity, then of course, seeing a beautiful woman won't cause a monk to lose his vows. It could actually be very beneficial. I don't know why I'm saying. Yesterday was International Women's Day. We should. You have to honor the role that women have played in the development of Buddhism. There was the Buddha's mother, his wife, and Sujata, who brought the yogurt, and so on. And then Amrapali, the courtesan, who became a great practitioner and reached enlightenment, and so on. All of these women in early Buddhism were absolutely vital to the tradition.
So this being the Hinayana or Sravakayana middle way, then how would you describe the, say, Yogācāra Middle Way?
Well, the Yogācāra Middle Way is, based on the distinction of what exists and what doesn't exist, and basically the Yogācāra position is that, relativity or interdependence exists. And also unreal or false imputation or false designation, designating the impure as pure, suffering as bliss, and so on. This kind of basic existential or conceptual confusions also exist, even though what they purport to be is false. They're literally it's untrue to think that pleasure is pain, but it's quite real and quite very much a fact that people think that people believe and cling to what they imagine as pleasure, when in fact, from a yogi's point of view, what they're clinging to is only suffering. It's just more subtle dukkha as opposed to more grotesque dukkha, right? But so both the unreal imputation or the false imputation, as well as the actual ground level of interdependence, these exist. But what doesn't exist is duality. There is no duality in that, and usually the absence of duality in the relative truth of the world is thought to be equivalent to mind only or idealism. But I think these days serious students of Yogācāra don't buy that model of interpretation for Yogācāra. The Yogācāra is more subtle than that.
Which is why actually Mipham says that Madhyāntavibhāga and Dharma-Dharmāntavibhāga can be either Madhyamaka or Yogācāra.
Or Chittamatra, you mean?
Chittamatra.
Does he actually say
sorry,
that?
no,
He says that?
He says Chittamatra, I'm sorry.
He says that.
He says in the introduction of Dharma-Dharmāntavibhāga, which you recommended me to read.
I have it's been so long since I read it, I forgot that he said that. But yes, But I think that's quite true. And the proof of that is that excuse me, that there was a master like Chandrakshita who wrote the Madhyamaka, which is considered Yogācāra Tantrika Madhyamaka. I mean, I think that's quite an accurate doxographical description of that text if you read and see what it actually says. So the final view there, of course, is the same as Prāsaṅgika. But the approach to the final Prāsaṅgika view and the Madhyamālaṅkāra is through the medium of Yogācāra and Svatantrika. So yes, of course they can be combined. Of course you can read Vasubandhu, the Madhyāntavibhāga and the Madhyāntavibhāga either way, of course. Yeah, and I think that it's unfortunate in Tibetan Buddhism, and this is also at least partly a function of the success of Gelugpa scholasticism, that these texts are not studied or appreciated more, because after the 14th or 15th century, during the life of Tsongkhapa, and subsequently, Chandrakirti and Prāsaṅgika was all the rage. But there's no question that even before Tsongkhapa, that many masters like Longchenpa, for example, thought that Prāsaṅgika was the final Madhyamaka view. It is the deepest or the most subtle, the one that you can't say that there is any philosophical viewpoint in Mahayana Buddhism that goes further than that, and then it gets to the heart of the matter better than that. But because this became a gradually and all-pervadingly accepted truth about Madhyamaka literature and Madhyamaka commentators, that the study of Chandrakirti particularly became paramount in Madhyamaka studies. And then the Yogācāra, that's just provisional. Those are just provisional teachings. They're not really definitive. This became the kind of, in a way, you could say it was a dismissive assumption. Don't want to say attitude, but it's an assumption that became so widespread that it just became a dismissal of these texts in the Gelugpa tradition, especially. Maybe less so in the Sakya, but in the Karmakagyu, which has a long and illustrious history of scholasticism, it was never the case like that. They always Yogācāra was important for them too.
So this brings me to the topic of hermeneutics.
Okay.
Then let's say, because maybe last week or 2 weeks ago we met with Rupa Rinpoche, and he was sharing with us about his hermeneutical composition.
Right.
So up until that point, I didn't realize that only the Gelugpas had this text by Tsongkhapa, hermeneutical text. I forget the name. You remember?
The Longchen
Nimpo. And then
Essence of Eloquence.
Essence of Eloquence. So that's what the Gelugpas used to interpret all the Buddhist texts.
That's right. That's how they organize their thinking regarding what is definitive and what is provisional in Zakya.
What is Mipham take on this?
Well, basically Mipham says, and this is, I think that this is, among other places, it's clarified in the medium commentary on the Sword of Discernment. That is the commentary by, I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the name of the commentator, but anyway. No, not Khenpo Pelden Sherab. It's like the one that Khenpo Pelden Sherab based his commentary on. Anyway, I'll remember it later, but it's not important. Anyway, there's one commentary on that text. There's an auto commentary in Mipham Rinpoche's own works that I don't know if it was published in the earlier redactions of Mipham's collected works, but in the later versions, apparently, there is a Chendrel, or just interlineary commentary on the Sword of Discernment. Hlaksom Tenpe Gyaltsen. Hlaksom Tenpe Gyaltsen is the author of a medium commentary, which you call a drelba, as opposed to a chen. A chen means just words are inserted in between the lines, and that becomes the commentary. But basically, it's mostly a gloss on individual words or phrases, but not actual discussion. But Hlaksom Tenpe Gyaltsen wrote an actual commentary, or drelba, or bash style commentary on the Sword of Discernment, and that's where Mipham's Zhanghe or hermeneutics is spelled out more or less, succinctly. It's quite succinct there. But so to make a long story short, he accepts the middle and final turnings, but the final turning of the wheel of Dharma, which corresponds to it corresponds to the so-called Yogācāra teachings, but it also corresponds to any discussion of the nature of gnosis or yeshe. That's more definitive in a way, because yeshe is the fruitional state, right? So the fruitional state, and also according to the proper understanding of the Mahayana Sutras, that wisdom or gnosis is also part of the ground of reality, because it's part and parcel of our Buddha nature. So it already exists. So it's not just a fruition, it's also the ground of reality. And in terms of the path, especially the path of the higher bhumis of the Mahayana path, or in terms of the Vajrayana path, and especially like Dzogchen and Mahamudra path, the yeshe or gnosis is the path as well. So it's the ground, it's the path, and it's also at the level of the result. And of course the tantras and the Nyingma tantras and Dzogchen teachings particularly, as well as the Mahamudra teachings, they make this quite clear. I think that this is this yeshe or wisdom, and since that's really a topic of the third turning of the wheel, therefore we can say that turning is more definitive. But it doesn't mean that it's really more definitive. Actually, emptiness, as it's taught in the Prāsaṅgika, and also the Prāsaṅgika also mentions gnosis. It just doesn't dwell on it as much as some of the other sutras, so-called Vaipulya or vast sutras, like the Ratmakutta and the Abhitamsaka, the Gandhavyuha, and so on. Those delve much more into the aspect of gnosis.
Which are the third turning of the wheel sutras. These three, right?
These are the third turning, right? But even in the Prāsaṅgika, gnosis is also mentioned, and emptiness is also is discussed or referred to frequently. Form is empty, emptiness is form. So but I think that from Nipham's point of view, we don't need to privilege one of these over the other as though they were somehow different, because actually you couldn't really have emptiness without gnosis. I mean, who knows emptiness anyway? I mean, a bodhisattva who has direct perception of emptiness, how does he or she know that? They know it through gnosis. They don't know it through ordinary mind. Ordinary mind has to stop thinking and stop being confused and stop being ambivalent in order for emptiness to be directly perceived. And so that means also that but if there's no gnosis, then there's the problem of there no longer being a conscious being. I mean, a bodhisattva at the first bhumi would ipso facto no longer be a sentient being, but they're still sentient. They still have emotions, right? They don't go completely beyond kleshas until the eighth bhumi. So I mean, there are technical reasons, but basically this is Mipham's view. His view is that emptiness and gnosis should be understood together, but even if you don't, you can regard both of them as definitive.
From this explanation, I understand that in a way, yeshe is the pramana of emptiness.
What's the Brahman?
The pramana, the sema.
Oh, the pramana. Oh, pramana. I thought you meant Brahman, like in the sense of Brahman and Advaita Vedanta.
Oh, no.
No. Yes. So, well, you could say yes. I mean, but it's not exactly pramana. I mean, in my book, The Beacon of Certainty, I use this word gnosiology, right? And I tried to distinguish that from epistemology, because gnosiology really is concerned with two things: with gnosis and what gnosis knows, right? Epistemology is concerned with what an ordinary mind knows and what kind of ordinary mind knows that thing, like in which context, right? So epistemology is more kind of nuts and bolts, you can say, and whereas gnosiology is like taking off in a hot air balloon, getting the bird's eye view and getting a vast experience of the world that way. It's not really the same as a pramana, but gnosiology also relates to the idea of moksha or freedom.
Is that what Mipham calls daksik tsema? Daksik tsema, I think.
I'm not sure I understand the Tibetan word.
the Dhamma of the pure vision.
Yes, right. That's right. That's right. He calls this a Dakwe Zignan Tanye Chepe Tsema, which means the pramana which relates to the conventions of pure perception. That means of enlightened beings, those who already reached the path of seeing, whether it's on the Hinayana or Mahayana level. So we can take scriptural statements or personal statements from anyone that is believed to have reached that level of enlightenment, that level of realization, as you could say, as a reason for drawing further conclusions. So for example, the fact that for example, in the Vimalakirti Sutra, most of the people around the Buddha there are able to see the world as a pure land, right? When the Buddha touches the ground with his big toe, and everyone has a vision of a pure land, and then someone asks Shariputra, who's like he's the whipping boy of that sutra, and it's Shariputra, how do you perceive this trichiliocosm, this triple myriad world, with all of its gods and humans and so on? How do you see it? And he said, I see it as though it were filled with shit. And everyone else is having this fantastic psychedelic vision of the universe, and Shariputra still sees it as a really shitty place. Now, I know a lot of Theravadins really take offense at that sutra because it makes so much fun of Shariputra. But you have to have a sense of humor about it. It's showing that even someone who is very much a venerable person might still not understand the point of view of purity. It's possible they wouldn't be able to wrap their minds around it. And if such a person existed, we would have to say that they were of a lesser grade of spiritual realization or merit than someone who could see it that way. So to be able to see the world in a pure way is a very blessed thing. I'm sure that many Theravada meditators and arhats do see it that way, but maybe not all of them. There may be some they qualify as arhats, that they don't qualify as having this Mahayana spirit, which is able to see things that way. But even someone who's an arhat can have the Mahayana spirit. It's possible. But the point is that we draw information from that sutra, which talks about pure phenomena that we don't see right now. We don't see the world exactly like that. We want to, but we don't. But because we believe it's possible, then we want to see it that way. Then we take the steps and take the measures of in our own lives and our practice and in our philosophical reflections. We try to move closer to actually having that point of view. So that's the sense in which the pure visions of enlightened beings becomes a kind of pramana for us. Similar, just as the sutras are a pramana for us also. Why? Because the Buddha spoke them and he made no errors there.
So it's a working hypothesis, in a way.
Well, it's, there could be some real serious debate around this. Is it really a pramana, or is it merely a correct assumption that the sutras are true? And it might just be a correct assumption if we don't have any learning about the sutras. But a correct assumption is never as solid a basis for meaningful action as an actual pramana. With an actual pramana, there's no doubt that it's true. If someone who becomes very well versed in the Buddhist teaching, then going on the basis of what the sutras say, even if we didn't have direct perception of emptiness or direct vision of the purity of all phenomena yet, but because we've studied so well and we have a basis and we can draw thoroughly warranted conclusions based on our gradual study. And eventually we can draw the thoroughly warranted conclusion that yes, the world is pure, it must be. Can't be anything else. Even if you didn't see it that way directly yet, but there could come a moment of certainty, like as in beacon of certainty, a moment of certainty where we're sure that that's true. And that's what the beacon of certainty makes this point in a very different way all throughout the discussion, especially topic 6.
Speaking of the purity of phenomena, I'm wondering if you can also say a few words about Mipham's view on Buddha nature.
Oh. Well, he says in his Lion's Roar of Buddha nature that okay, well, there basically, there's our system, but first we'll describe, the two mistaken points of view on Buddha nature. One is basically the, super gung-ho Shentong point of view, like maybe you can say Shentong on steroids, right? He's not saying all Shentong, but Shentong on steroids, that's one mistaken view. And the other one is to say that Entin is the Gelugpa view, but he doesn't say Gelugpa, but it's obviously that's what he's talking about, which says that that basically the Buddha nature is just a megak. It's a non-affirming negation. It's emptiness, pure and simple, like that. So those are the two extremes of interpretation that he excludes both of those.
Which is, I guess, what Gorampa would say, right? Also,
Pretty much, I think, but I don't know that Gorampa ever really wrote about Bishop Ningpo.
but he says that about Madhyamaka, Gorampa.
But well, yes. I mean, yes. Again, yeah, right. Because the teaching on Buddha nature is considered part of Madhyamaka teaching by Tibetan scholars. It's considered to. I mean, the Ratnagotravibhāga is regarded nowadays by practically everyone who's studied it well. The Gyu Lama I'm talking about. Excuse me. The Gyu Lama is regarded by practically everyone as a text belonging to the Prāsaṅgika Madhyamaka view.
So now, Mipham, besides having written this, I mean, basically written about everything, right? Mipham has covered commentaries on all the most important treatises, etc. And something that surprised me is that he has this commentary on the Kama Sutra. And I'm wondering how can a monk, because he had monastic vows, right?
Yes.
How do you see him being able to compose a
Well,
commentary of the Kama Sutra?
it was the opinion of Gene Smith. He said that that Mipham, it was not his most scintillating composition, but I looked at it again not so long ago, and I thought that even though it doesn't contain as much practical information as Genren Chopel's, right? And Genren Chopel, said that this is not like Ju Mipham's Kama Shastra, because my Kama Shastra is based on direct experience. So the implication is, well, I mean, Mipham didn't travel in India, and he wasn't a student of a kind of freewheeling, Mahapandit and a lover of women like Rahul Sankrajayana, who was, one of the, he's like, Rahul Sankrajayana, right? He was the guru of Genren Chopel, and he was a Marxist. And apparently he took Genren Chopel around to some brothels. We don't know the exact story, but obviously when Genren Chopel was in India and maybe also in France when he went to Paris and so on, he probably had a lot of experiences. I don't know if his Kama Shastra was written after his trip to Europe or not, but Genren Chopel got around. Yeah, he did have more experience than Mipham, but I don't think it means that Mipham Rinpoche was totally inexperienced. I read through his Kama Shastra again not so long ago. I read parts of it, and it seemed to me like I think he probably did have a consort at some point. I believe that. But that's just my opinion. No one knows for sure. And, in the Nyingma tradition, if someone who is, let's say, is practically a natural-born monk, and really to be a scholar in Tibet, or, for many people, being a scholar practically means having to live like a monk. Even if you don't want to, you have to. I mean, it takes so much time to always be involved with books and to be, a Buddhist teacher. Also, if you're teaching philosophy, who are you teaching? You're teaching monks. If you're not yourself a monk, then you're not necessarily a very good example or a good influence on monks. So it's practically necessary for most, for most teachers who teach philosophy or who are great scholars to live like a monk most of the time.
Because of the time it takes to memorize.
Well, it's not, but it's not, it's not always true. Like, for example, Kunu Rinpoche, he was not a monk. He did have a woman in his life. And someone recently who knew him well told me this. I didn't know that. I mean, I didn't think he was a monk because he's never, in all the photos of Kunu Rinpoche, we don't see him wearing monk's robes ever. He's always dressed like a layperson. I mean, he was a saint and he was a very humble person, but doesn't mean he had to be a monk. So Mipham Rinpoche may not always have been a celibate monk. But, in the Nyingma tradition, at least, and I think for practical intents and purposes, in the Sakya and the Kagyu also, if someone has monk's vows and needs a consort at some point, they will find that person, or their teacher will hook them up with that person, so that they can have that experience, because that might be necessary for various reasons, for their realization, or also for their health, or for both. The previous Dzogchen Rinpoche was married when he was already in his 50s. He was given a consort. I don't know who arranged that or how that happened exactly, but I don't think he went out shopping. He didn't go on Kindle. He didn't use an app. They had the deep karmic connection. Conversing Chudra, what's her name? Anyway, yeah, she's very, very famous, and now her face is familiar. Everyone has seen a picture of her face. And so, yeah. But I mean, in that case, it was more openly done. But as far as we know, up until that point, the previous Dzogchen Khyentse was practically a monk. And it may also have been the case with Mipham Rinpoche. I think in different places, reading through his collected works, I occasionally get a little whiff that like maybe he had a consort at some point, but not continuously. No, he wasn't that kind of siddha. He was a siddha, but he wasn't a Drupa Kunle variety siddha. Not even close.
So Mipham having such a vast literary output, right? How much, currently speaking about nowadays, how much has he influenced what is happening nowadays in the Shedras, particularly?
Well, in the Shedras, they use all different texts and commentaries, and each one is different. I really have no idea who is using what text in which Shedra. I haven't a clue. But they must be studying some works of Mipham and Shechen. That would stand to reason, And certainly in Nandra Ling, they study Mipham Rinpoche's writings.
Sure.
And in Serta, in Golok, founded by Khenpo Jime Phuntsok Rinpoche, which is a huge community of monks, nuns, and lay practitioners, Ngakpas and Ngakmas and so on. So, I mean, certainly many people there, and they have Shedra too, and there are many Khenpos, teaching, and I'm sure many of them are teaching for Mipham Rinpoche's texts. Yeah, because especially for Khenpo Jime Phuntsok, Mipham was everything. He was super devoted to Lama Mipham, and he had visions and wrote a very profound Guru Yoga of Mipham Rinpoche from using the language of Dzogchen Chenpo and so on. So yes. So, but again, I don't know exactly which text they use and how they structure their curriculum. And there are other authors too that they would want to read, like, the Domsung commentary of Ngari Panchen is considered very important, so they use that.
But these two are the main Shedras, I guess, in the world, Namdrling and Larungar, right?
Yes, Larungar,
For Nyingma.
exactly, yeah.
Actually, so...
Yeah, that's right.
So for somebody who is just getting started with Mipham, how would you recommend?
What would I recommend? Well, I don't know if it's been translated or not, or if parts have been translated here or there. I don't really know. But one of my favorite parts of his collected works is the advice, collected advice. And, there's advice for mantrikas, advice for monks, and especially for new monks, advice for lay people. In a similar vein, there's advice for the king of Derge. That's usually considered not simply advice, but it's a different genre called Niti Shastra, which means treatise on rulership. But it's part of his cycle of advice to different people. It just happens to be one of the longer texts. And it's written for a king, so, and it dwells on, how to rule the country well as a Dharma king. And other advice, and especially his songs, and then his fifth instructions on meditation, which look at meditation from the standpoint of Madhyamaka, Mahamudra, and especially in Dzogchen. So these are the practical and relatively short compositions of Mipham Rinpoche. If they were all translated, and some of the Dzogchen maybe couldn't be published openly, but a lot of it is, of the variety or grade of Dzogchen instruction that anyone can read, and help their understanding. So if those were all collected and put in one place, I would say, that's where to go first, because that's where you'll get practical advice: how to live your life, how to do your practice, how to purify your motivation, how to have the right motivation, and as well as the right view, and so. And that's where I always go back. Is I always go back to reading his practical advice, because they're so condensed and so juicy that I get tremendous inspiration from them. But if you're more of a philosophy student and maybe less of a meditator, or if you're not looking for devotional inspiration in your practice, then the Beacon of Certainty is a good place to start. But if you are more of an academic or Madhyamaka student and scholar, then certainly the Madhyamālaṅkāra commentary is a great place to begin, because that's, I think, a little bit easier to understand them, at least a little bit, maybe a lot more, but it's certainly easier to understand than the commentary on Chandrakirti. But both of those are very good for anyone who's a Madhyamaka student.
Mm-hmm. No. Very nice. So before we conclude, I also wanted to ask you about the current state of Buddhism in Nepal, particularly.
Oh, in Nepal.
Yeah.
Well, one Lama, we were discussing him a little bit earlier. I know that he felt that the current state of Buddhism here is not that good, and maybe he just said that in frustration. But in here in Nepal particularly, well, I really don't go around and, I'm not interviewing people inside of monasteries or observing the behavior of monks. And I really can't say anything about what this Gompa or that Gompa is like. I personally believe that there are still a lot of great practitioners here. And, inside Dujum Gompa, for example, I know there's at least one Lama there. I met him and he impressed me very much. And other friends of mine have gone and talked to this Lama and had a very good experience. My Nepali friends, Goten had, have been, one of my Nepali friends went there and struck up a conversation. And he learned some amazing things from this Lama, just having a casual conversation. So it shows you that there are great people. They may not be well known as teachers necessarily, but there are great practitioners. So
may we know who this Lama is?
With the Lama at the Dujum Gompa, I forget his name, but he's sort of the the Kempo, or the teacher who looks after the younger monks and is highly qualified as a Lopan in the monastery. I don't know his name, but I know I met him once before also, because I had a brief conversation with him maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And but I'm just using it as an example, and also Karma Rinpoche, from Bhutan, your Karma's father. Drupal Lama Karma. He doesn't live here, but we're hoping he'll be living here a lot more later this year, right?
Yes.
And he's also a great Lama. He's a great practitioner, great practitioner. So, so in that sense, I can say, Buddhism is not dead in Nepal. But I think that the institutions of the monasteries, the Tibetan or Vajrayana style monasteries, I think that this whole institutional model is challenged. There are problems with it. There may be problems of discipline, or there are problems of not having enough education, or there are too many monks who are there only because they want a free ride. Or nuns who are there because they had nowhere else to go. They're traumatized women who see no hope in a family life, because of whatever happened when they were young, and so on. For example, it doesn't mean that they have no business there. It just means that inside of a monastery or a nunnery, it's a whole other can of worms, so to speak. because first of all, there's the ordinary competitions that people have, and there are the politics, and some people's conduct may be quite bad. Some of them may be, breaking their vows. I mean, when it comes to celibacy, there are infractions that can be purified, and then there are those that are expulsible. But if the people are committing expulsible offenses, in terms of just basically having, good old randy sex, and then lying about it and not confessing it, then of course the monastic rule is broken for everyone. Actually, to have someone like that in your midst would really be bad for the morale of a monastic community. But these scenarios are known to arise, not just here, but also, in Thailand and certain places. There's drugs, there's porn, sex, and even, much in actual, felonious crimes. I mean, serious crimes being committed sometimes by members of the monastic community. And then, of course, there's also the whole issue of money. And some lamas are very attracted to the money and to the power, and not really that interested in, or not properly committed to practicing the Dharma. But they still might carry on with the appearance of lamas and so on. I mean, I'm not referring to anybody in particular, or anyone that concerns us directly here. But I'm just saying that these are problems that exist, and they have existed always in the Buddhist monastic community. It's nothing new. So if it's worse or not, I can't say. I'd like to think that there's always a good deal of hope. I think the greatest hope really is it's up to each of us. We found the Dharma. We have teachers. We have Sangha friends, and we enjoy camaraderie and mutual support. And as long as we stay true to the basic principles of Buddhism, then Buddhism is alive in us. Even if it doesn't exist in a monastery at all, but thank goodness it still does exist in a monastery. It's really important for people, lay people in particular, need to see monks and nuns to stay inspired. We need to see ordained people. We need to be around them, and of course, if they are really good at their practice, then so much the better. But even if they're only average, it's still an inspiration, and we can gain merit by supporting them, by helping them, and that keeps our lives as lay people, keeps us happier. So we have that, we still have that here in Nepal, a lot, actually, more than any other country in the world. At least for Mahayana and Vajrayana, we have more of that here than anywhere else, still. And then some parts of India, of course, but like Bailakapa and the many monasteries there also. I haven't been there, but yeah. So Nepal is the one, the only Mahayana Buddhist country that's always been both Mahayana and Buddhist, and now it's also a Theravada Buddhist country.
Any final remarks from you, John? Anything else you want to share?
Let's see. There was something, and I'm trying to remember what it was now. It must not have been very important because I can't remember what I was thinking the other day along those lines. But for you personally, I think what you're doing is great. Your research, and I really appreciate your good questions. And for anyone else who happens to hear this podcast, I would say, I wish you all the best of luck and good fortune, studying Dharma and just living a good human existence. And if you're here in Nepal, I think I want to just observe one thing about Nepal is that this is, in spite of being a relatively undeveloped country, it's still one of the safest and happiest places to live anywhere in the world. So I think we're very lucky to be here. And I'm grateful.
I agree. Maybe. And on that note, anybody who wants to come to Nepal and experience the Buddhist sites, I'm going to put my website on the description of this video. I organize tours around the Buddhist sites of Nepal and some of the bayous, some of the sacred sites of Guru Rinpoche. and now it seems we don't have a camera anymore, but we are at our friend Arogya's statue shop, which is right in front of the Buddha stupa, Rupa Maker. So he's collaborating with us very kindly. We want to invite anybody who comes to Buddha stupa to visit his shop. Maybe he can add some pictures at this while we say this. And John's friend has a really good friend who's also a healer, and maybe
Oh yes, of course, Shruti Rai and the Chara Healing Center. Yes, that's always a good resource, especially if you if you need some healing, hands-on healing, energy healing, and so on. Of course, yes. She's just preparing to come back from Indonesia, the Prominent Women in Buddhism Conference. That's and she was chosen to receive some kind of commendation by the organizers of that conference and to give us a short talk there.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll let her link her website or Facebook or something here for people who want to also check her out.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and we really appreciate it. Thank you for being so open with all your knowledge. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.